Welcome to Gambling with an Edge. And now, here are Bob and Richard.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Gambling with an Edge. I'm Bob Dancer.
And I'm Richard Munchkin.
Our guest today is someone you've likely never heard of. Mark Johnson was a recent postdoc at the UNLV Centers for Gaming Research. Richard and I heard a presentation at the end of his stay at UNLV and invited him to join us today. He's back in London, and so this is a long-distance interview. Mark Johnson, welcome to Gambling with an Edge.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
Mark, you spent about a month at UNLV. What were you looking at, and why is it important to be at UNLV to do this study?
So my kind of field of research is basically anywhere where play and money meet, and my main field of study is what's known as esports, which is basically playing video games as your source of income. But outside of that, I have quite a strong interest in gambling as well, especially pro and kind of highly skilled gambling, more kind of broadly speaking. And the reason I wanted to do the study I did was that esports, which is pro video gameplay, esports is quite a new thing, and it has become extremely big extremely quickly. And when you read about it, pretty much every kind of major newspaper has talked over esports at least once now. Most kind of critical commentary websites and magazines and so forth have talked about esports quite a bit as well. And when you read these, there's this real kind of focus on this idea that playing games rather than sports in this regard, playing games is something deeply new and something deeply contemporary and something which is far more kind of unusual than perhaps it truly is. In that clearly people have been playing games such as card games and other gambling games as their source of income for years, for centuries, maybe even longer. And so I wanted to kind of look at what are the differences and what are the commonalities between being a pro gambler and being a pro gamer, and based on that to try and kind of to both counter this idea that playing games as your source of income is something super new and super weird, but also to look a little bit at if the lives of these two groups of people do differ a lot, then why? Kind of what are the kind of ecosystems that a pro gambler and a pro gamer exist in, and why are these so strongly divergent? And what can we kind of learn from that about what it's like to play games broadly conceived as one source of income. So at UNLV, I wanted to use their extensive archive to look at basically what kinds of books have gamblers written about their own lives, and what kinds of books have been written by others about the lives of gamblers.
So Richard's book, Gambling Wizards, was mentioned in your research numerous times. He wrote about a number of gamblers in that book. And what other books were used that we may have heard of?
A lot of the kind of biographies of, a lot of the biographies or the autobiographies of a lot of people like Bobby Baldwin or Doyle Brunson and people like this. Also quite a lot written about kind of hustlers or advantage players, such as Titanic Thompson for instance, and also a lot of works which varied in terms of the kind of the kind of veracity of what they claim to offer, but quite a lot of kind of manuals, I guess, about how to be a pro poker player or a pro slots player and things of this sort. And whilst some of those were more convincing than some of the others, in terms of the extent to which one feels the author kind of truly knew the topic that they were speaking of. In all of these cases, we either had gamblers speaking about themselves, or others looking at and drawing kind of broader conclusions about what it means to be a pro gambler, or people reflecting on what the kind of broader kind of social picture of pro gambling looks like.
So esports is pretty young. I wouldn't think there's a lot of literature, biographies or autobiographies of professional esports players. Were you able to find any literature like that, or was it all done through interviews?
So for my esports research, that was done prior to my 1 month at UNLV. In the last year, myself and a colleague from the London School of Economics, we've spoken to about 50 or 60 either pro esports players or people who earn a living through pro gameplay of other forms. We've spent a couple hundred hours at esports events in the UK, in the US, in Germany, in Poland. And so that was the data I wanted to draw on to contrast with what I could learn from the archives at UNLV on pro gamblers rather than on pro game players. And also, although you are right, and there's very little book work written on pro esports players, there's a decent amount of academic work in this field so far, and also a lot of work on kind of news sites and things of this sort, where people will have interviewed esports players and quite often ask them about their lives and what they kind of do each day and things of this sort. So that kind of textual data also stood alongside the first-hand data on esports players, which I picked up in the last kind of 12 to 18 months.
So let's talk about some of the differences between professional gamblers and esports players. Let's start, say, with hours. How are the hours that pro gamblers put in different from those of pro esports gamers?
Yeah, so this is quite a kind of intriguing one, I think. So I found that pro gamblers in general tend to live extremely flexible lives in terms of where they play and when they play, and quite a lot of people in the texts I studied insisted that this was one of the kind of big pros of this kind of job, in that one could play in the day or at night or every day for a month or no days, and that as part of kind of pursuing good games and good matches, one might visit many different cities or many different countries and things of this sort. And yet at the same time, a lot also stressed that although they had the freedom to play whenever they wanted, the kind of dark kind of flip side of that was that although they could choose to play any time, they were also sometimes kind of forced to play any time, in that pro gamblers, at least in part, were highly dependent on when good games turned up and had to shape their time, which was especially tricky with families and children and things of this sort, in order to find the kinds of games they wanted to play. On the flip side, though, esports players, although we think of video games as being far more kind of trivial and far more kind of playful maybe than a lot of forms of gambling, in general pro esports players live incredibly kind of tightly structured and tightly regimented lives, in that they are expected to train for, say, 12 hours a day, every day, in anticipation of the kind of biggest esports contests. And lots of esports players live in what are called team houses, where the team that they belong to kind of structures their days and encourages them to practice to play alongside other players within the same team. And there was also a split here in terms of when players practice and when players play, in that pro gamblers tended, it seemed, to practice and play at the same time, in the sense of whenever one is playing for money, and therefore one is likely practicing at the same point. Whereas in the case of esports players, they might be playing for cash only 10 times a year, 20 times a year or so, maybe even less, because in general these players can only earn money within national or ideally global tournament contests. So there was also a split there in terms of the kind of how the income of these players varied across the time they put into their game playing practices.
I'm going to disagree with at least part of that, at least when it comes to video poker. When I'm at the machine grinding out the play, by that time I've already memorized a strategy or gotten as good at it as I can, and that study of the game was done away from the game. While I'm putting in the hours, basically trying to play the game computer perfect, that's far too late to be studying the game then. It's the study came before. And so my study time and my gambling time are pretty much different.
I think, there are there's a lot of variance depending on the game. So
definitely.
Blackjack is also a game that you have to study beforehand, whereas, say, pool or poker, you're improving your game by actually playing it. Although in poker, yes, there is time spent away from the game also studying, but you're also learning when you're actually playing. So, I mean, different games are different.
Oh, yes. I don't think this is a kind of complete, absolute difference in terms of the gap between practice and play, but I think if we counted up the hours that most gamblers practice versus play and compared that to esports players, where we can practice as playing the game or studying the game without money at stake, and players playing with money at stake, I think we would still see on average a fairly strong divergence there, as most esports events, which you might train for say half a year, last 2 days or 3 days or so. And so I think although clearly gamblers do practice their games away from the play of the game itself, I think the two are somewhat more closely linked in general, where as for esports players, a truly gigantic volume of their time is spent in practice, and only the tiniest block of that time is spent kind of putting those skills to use.
So in that way, it's really much more like a sport.
Yes, definitely.
All right, you mentioned money in there. How is the way gamblers earn money different than the way esporters earn money?
So, esports players pretty much only earn money through winning or placing extremely highly within tournament events, and this is clearly very close to something like tournament-focused poker players, which I was back in the day. But compared to most forms of gambling, such as cash games in the game of poker and in many other spaces too, you don't tend to profit within kind of pre-established spaces and pre-established times. So esports players know months and sometimes even years prior exactly what it is they need to train for and what exact moments it is that they need to play with a high level of skill within in order to profit. In terms of gamblers, by contrast, although clearly there are specific set events in lots of gambling forms, such as mainly poker, but also blackjack, for instance. Although these do exist, in general, one can win or of course lose on pretty much any day of the year. And this goes back to the previous point about how working hours differ, in that one has a chance, if the right games are found and the right stakes are being played for and so forth, one has the chance to win and to profit and to make money pretty much any day, effectively. And from what I found so far, this also seems to affect players' kind of reflections upon money, in that gamblers tend to see money as something far more to do with kind of keeping score, and something which even if you gamble as your source of income, something which is slightly more flexible, slightly more fluid, slightly more easy come, easy go, and so forth. Whereas esports players tend to put very little focus, if any, on their lifetime winnings. They seem to care far more about winning a major tourney, or winning a major contest, or beating certain players within a certain event, irrespective of whether the money is involved there. So whereas for esports players, money is something far more formal and far more rigid, and they can kind of, broadly speaking, anticipate or at least guess when money might come in. For pro gamblers, it's far more fluid and far more varied.
So how much money can these top esports players make?
Great question. So to an extent, how much esports players make from being sponsored and from being on teams is not entirely public, but in terms of specific events, some esports events pay out in the 7 figures, most pay out in the 6 figures, and then there's a kind of lower tier of nationally focused esports events which tend to pay out in the kind of mid to high 5-figure region. The most successful esports players have made well into the low to mid millions, but most full-time esports pros are probably somewhere in the mid 6-figure range, I'd say, roughly speaking. But there's also a pretty huge amount of variance here, in that you can have events with, say, 3,000 people who enter, and the person who comes first will get, say, 60 times the person who comes sixth within an event with so many people competing. So much like being a tournament-focused poker player, if you are an esports player, although clearly your income, broadly speaking, implies your skill, based on the kind of specific variance within big money esports events, it wouldn't be hard for a more skilled player to earn slightly less, a less skilled player to earn slightly more, and things of that sort as well.
Isn't there gambling on the esports through something called skins? Can you explain that? Yes,
sure. So, skin gambling is a pretty bizarre thing, I think, broadly speaking. So, a lot of games allow you to apply kind of cosmetic changes to how your in-game character or your in-game gun or your armor or things of this sort to change how these things look without changing gameplay. And one of the most well-known games for this is what's called Counter-Strike Source. Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which is a first-person shooter game where you play in teams of 5, and it's a first-person shooter, so you basically have to kill the other team prior to them killing you. And in this game, there are loads of skins, as they are called, which you can apply to your guns, and to a far less extent in lots of games to how your character looks. And last year, it was thought that somewhere in the range of $6 or $7 billion was gambled in skins, which is basically where players bet these pragmatically useless but high status virtual items on the outcomes of esports games or on the outcomes of other games and other contests too. So this is basically a fully kind of grey market trade. It's not completely legal. It's not completely not legal. A lot of esports gambling takes place on sites which are run by single people rather than more kind of rather than larger companies. And esports gambling is something which I think, at least, and I'm doing quite a bit of work on this right now, really kind of highlights how games and gambling are blurring. And although I don't know if there are any pro esports bettors on Earth right now, if there are, I think that really will be a very kind of intriguing case study to see how gamblers adapt to new kind of betting markets.
And so these skins, you're able to convert them to and from cash, right?
Sometimes to a greater or less extent, depending on the service you use. But in general, that is an option, yes. But in other cases, people prefer to use them for the kind of status symbol aspect that they show within these game worlds. As in most cases, if say if there's a certain skin which you earn by, say, playing 10,000 hours, say, but instead of playing 10,000 hours and thereby being kind of assumed to be as skilled as you would be if you played that long, if you gamble and you win it, then you can use that skin without kind of having earned it in a skill sense, but having earned it in a luck sense. So there's and right now, at least, this is something which is very much unstudied. But I think we need to look at how the status of skins, which is to say the status of the item you gamble with, as a kind of social capital thing, how that shapes people's gambling practices within this kind of space.
Yeah, my understanding is that there's a whole underground betting market that can be converted to cash.
Yes.
And they're using this to circumvent the laws. And I don't know, it sort of reminds me of Bitcoin, like money is what we all decide it is. You know what
yes,
I mean?
Absolutely, yeah. Mm.
Another thing related to money that I don't think was covered in your sports, in your paper, but it might be. If a e-gamer, all the e-gamers who have won at least $500,000 in a tournament are known somewhere. In other words, it's published when you win that big of an event. And I have no idea how many different years, if any, Richard won more than $500,000, or he has no idea other than 1 year, which I wrote about, how many years I won more than $500,000. So most gamblers do not really know outside of the tournament areas how much money other gamblers have or have not made.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's a crucial difference in lots of ways, especially because the idea of hustling, as done within pro kind of gambling spaces, is entirely unknown within esports, precisely for that kind of reason. Because when you play someone new, all you do is to basically go on to Google and type in their name, and you will find what games they play and how much money they've made from those games. And so being able to present one's skill as being lower or I guess higher than it truly is basically just something that you can't do within this space at all. And therefore the only times when kind of prop bets and things of this sort take place within esports is basically a question of ego rather than a question of not potentially knowing the skill of the person who you are betting versus, in that most prop bets within esports will be between two players who are roughly of equal skill, and they each feel, though, that they have a small edge based on what they know of the other player, which is probably pretty much everything, that they have some kind of edge.
Very much like golf in that way. A lot of prop bets, a lot of ego getting involved in making good decisions. You had mentioned that sometimes the players try to disguise themselves by using a barcode name.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Sure, yes. So I believe this can't be done anymore, but up until a little while back, on StarCraft 2, which is a big esports game, especially within South Korea, in the font used for usernames when you signed up to play it, the uppercase I, the lowercase L, and the kind of vertical bar symbol, I think it was those three, those all looked exactly the same. So players who wanted to play without other players being able to know who they are would construct usernames from only those characters, and therefore all these players who became kind of collectively known as barcode players, no one could tell which barcode player you were playing at one point. And although there was no money kind of instantly at stake in this kind of play, because people were only playing for practice online, it did mean that the amount of data your foes had on you when they next played you in person was lower than it would be in most esports, because no one knew who each barcode player was.
How many games are esports players typically proficient at?
In general, and this is the case for maybe 99% of esports players, 98 maybe, one game only, and this is basically because, like I mentioned prior, the cash payouts within esports events are so highly weighted towards being first or kind of second or third, say, that it only pays to be the absolute best in one game rather than to be, say, the fourth best in more games. And this also, of course, in turn links back into what I said about the lack of kind of side bets within esports, broadly speaking, in that because relative skill is not something you can really profit from, where as if you are gambling versus other players, you simply have to be better than those players to make money. Of course, in esports, because all the money comes from finishing high within specific tournament contexts, there's no kind of need to be skilled at mini games like a lot of pro gamblers are. The real kind of economic imperative, the real kind of economic imperative is to be extremely skilled at one game, and ideally to be the single world's best player in that game, rather than being able to play a wide range of games to a very high but not necessarily total top world class level.
But some of these esport games have hundreds of thousands or even millions of competitors in it. I would think one would know rather quickly whether one had the ability to become the number one in the world. There's sometimes you just know very quickly that you can never get that good. Wouldn't that be true? And in that case, wouldn't it be better to branch out?
That's a very intriguing question. I don't think players are necessarily able to detect that in themselves, and I don't mean that in a condescending way, but there's quite a large group, and this is a group I'd like to kind of look at more in the future. But there's quite a big group of players who try to go pro and then don't make it, basically, and clearly that's the case in gambling as well, and. Yeah. Precisely why this takes place in esports and why esports players, or rather why aspiring esports players struggle to identify their true kind of potential at these games. Why exactly that is something that needs to be studied more. But I think it's very hard to tell whether you can make it that good. And I guess that there's a bunch of reasons for that, which is one, that esports games and competitive games in general, the rule sets in these games are vastly more complex than in even, say, poker or, say, bridge. In that something like League of Legends, which is a 5v5 team game, each player plays as one character in game, and there are something like 100 characters in League, I think. And to be a top-class League player, you have to know, roughly speaking, how every single one of those characters plays against all the other 99, and that's thousands and thousands of permutations, which you need to know in really great depth in order to be able to play these kinds of games. So even if players know the kind of breadth of knowledge that they have to gain, I think it's hard to kind of address what it's tricky to kind of look at one's self and ask, can I gain this kind of knowledge or not? And then a second part is that these games need so much kind of physical reflex skill, and that is something which is gained slowly over time through practice and through training rather than something you have instantly. Again, I think it's hard for players to ask themselves, can I get this fast, or will I always be just a tiny bit too slow to break into that kind of top space? And then I guess the third reason is also to do with how the kind of esports ecosystem is kind of structured, in that I think a lot of esports players tend to be extremely young, as most esports pros are between, say, 16 and 23 or so. And again, I don't mean this in a patronizing way, but without a deep knowledge of things like jobs, of things like contracts, of things like training hours, of kind of truly making sense of what it is in one's life one has to sacrifice in order to obtain the top level of skill within these games. I think a lot of players also don't kind of know whether that's a life that they are either A, suited to, or B, that they are even kind of willing to have, if they do become skilled enough, that kind of life then beckons.
Well, I also think it just boils down to love of the game. If you look at any game, whether it's, tennis, chess, poker, whatever, I think people spend their whole lives playing the games not thinking they're going to be able to be one of the best or make a living at it, but they just keep plodding away at it because that's the game they like to play,
Oh, yeah. It's definitely a decent number of people who are esports pros now definitely didn't plan to be that. Yes. But I think the percentage of esports players in the next, say, 10 years who didn't specifically plan to become esports players, I think that percentage will drop as esports player becomes a stronger and a more kind of visible aspirational goal for those who play these kinds of video games.
I don't know how familiar you are with basketball in the United States, but
not very, I'm afraid.
Assume for now that I'll pick two players. There's a broad number I could pick, but say Derrick Rose and Kyrie Irving, who have faster, what we would call quick twitch muscle than almost anybody else. And so they can do things side to side much better than other people can. And that was known when they were 12 years old or some such. And so at whatever level they were, as they grew up in high school and in college and in whatever path they were always the best. Now, a certain part of this e-gaming has to also be quick twitch muscles and reflexes.
Oh, yes.
And I would think it would be known fairly quickly if you were one of the elite or you weren't.
Interesting. I think there's probably two reasons why that isn't yet the case in esports. I think it's partly because esports hasn't yet reached a level of kind of formalization or of kind of corporate interest, maybe, where people are being scouted from that kind of age, or where you have the kind of knowledge within people who watch for new young players to spot these types of things. I don't think anyone on Earth right now has the skill to spot a potentially top esports player based on their Twitch reflex skill in the same kind of way that you've outlined there. And then I think the second reason why that's not necessarily known within esports, at least, is that, how can I put it? I think the kind of reflex skill that is required in video games, I think, is quite different in lots of ways from even within very twitch and reflex heavy physical sports such as basketball. And it's quite hard to put into words precisely how. It's that if one watches a pro basketball player, and I do speak here as a person who knows zilch about this sport, but there's a commonality between watching the actions of the player and understanding the effect those actions have on the game, such as passing and shooting and so forth. Whereas in esports, because the game is played within a digital space, but actions are taken within a physical space, there's a divide in kind of comprehension between how the physical actions of players translate in a kind of practical sense to the strategic and kind of game playing and game winning choices within the digital space within where the game itself is being played out. And a lot of gaining skill at a competitive video game is coming to kind of connect the two in a way which is somewhat more inherent, I think, within physical sports. And that, I think, makes it trickier to spot whether someone has the reflex skills they need, because that person can't train themselves on those skills until they've worked out precisely what those skills even are.
Although it seems to me that once people want to look for those skills, they'll have better data than any sport, because definitely online, yeah, and they can time to the millisecond how quickly somebody reacts to something once they're actually looking for that data.
Absolutely, I think so too. Yeah.
All right, we're talking to Mark Johnson about the difference between professional gamblers and professional esports gamers. And because he doesn't know a lot about American basketball, we're going to take a brief commercial break. Hang on, we'll be right back.
The South Point has more than 10,000 games, returning more than 99%. This is more than anyone else has. In August, in the Summer Sizzling Seat giveaway, every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 9 a.m. to 2 a.m. the following day, approximately 20 random players each hour will be awarded $100. Week 5 of the free video poker classes, Wednesday, August 30th, will be 9-6 Bonus Poker Deluxe. This is a 99.64% game that is like jacks or better, except you receive more for quads and less for 2-pair. The strategy is similar to jacks or better, but there are some differences. If you're planning to come to the advanced classes on September 6th, this class, or knowledge of the game, is a prerequisite. The beginner's class will start at noon, intermediate class at 2 p.m. The classes are in the Silverado Lounge, which is immediately in front of Don Vito's restaurant. Everyone at least 21 years of age is welcome. At videopoker.com, it's the best place to play lots of games. If you sign up for the gold membership, $8.95 a month or $79.95 a year, this allows you to get corrections on most of the games. The game of the week is 100 Play Quick Quads, which is my idea of a fun video poker game, should you be able to find good pay schedules in this variety, which to date I haven't. Quick Quads is a 6 coin per line game where you get extra 4 of a kind because trips, where the other 2 guards add up to the rank of the trips, count as quads. That is 88844 or 88853, pay just as much as 8888. And since it's 6 coins per line instead of 5, that makes the math all work out.
All right, we're back talking to Mark Johnson. Now, in certain types of gambling, you find hustling or cheating, which are the same, only they're not the same.
Yeah.
How much of that do you find in esports gaming?
So, like we mentioned previously, hustling is pretty much takes place nowhere within esports because there is always so much more knowledge on the people who you are playing within esports than within pro gambling practice, and even kind of related things such as advantage play also don't take place because you never really play against the house when you are an esports player. But in terms of cheating's a very intriguing one. Cheating within esports kind of comes down to 3 aspects, I guess. The firstly is throwing matches, which is clearly known in all sports, and that's been fairly small within esports so far. Although about 2 years ago, a really top South Korean player was proven, I think, Gil, that he'd thrown quite a few matches for something like $60,000 or $70,000, which seems a surprisingly low amount of money to do that for, compared to what we would expect match fixing within physical sports to look like. But that's largely a result of how little money a lot of esports players do make, and so that's one aspect of cheating within esports. And then the second is the kind of contested line between what's a really strong and really clever tactic and what's a cheat. As quite a few times in quite a few esports, there have been times where someone has done something which they felt was them cleverly exploiting the game's systems, but where external viewers or a game's judges or a game's development company felt was more like a cheat rather than like a tactic, and these are things where where there's something written into the game's rules which no one knew was there, and players found a way to do it, and then won a match or won a tournament or won money on the back of that. And so that sometimes gets defined as cheating and sometimes doesn't. It's somewhat like advantage play in that sense, in that there's a kind of contest of strength between whether or not this is a tactic or whether this is a cheat. And then the third kind is the most kind of obvious in terms of somehow cheating in terms of one's physical body or in terms of the hardware that one uses. So quite a few esports players have been found to be using drugs which enhance your reflexes or enhance your attention spans. And although drug tests are not used within all esports yet, I think that will be the case in, say, 5 years or so. And then in terms of technology, prior to playing an esports match, most people have their mice and their keyboards and so forth checked to make sure that there's nothing hard-coded into the keyboard or into the mouse, which would allow them to take actions within the game which they shouldn't be able to take. Right now, I think esports is, compared to most sports where cheating takes place, esports is surprisingly unmonitored. But the fact that people do throw matches, the fact that people try to do things which are kind of a cheat but kind of a tactic but probably more like a cheat, and the fact that people are already taking drugs to enhance how well they play, I think the combo of these three things means that in the next, say, 5-10 years, cheating will both become bigger within esports as there's more cash to be won, but also something being watched and being tracked far more assiduously as well.
Two things. One, you said that hustling isn't going on, but I can guarantee you, if skins can be turned into cash, there are good players who are playing, under their girlfriend's account or somebody else who's a weak player, and playing for money and hustling in that way. I mean, it's just,
good thought. Yeah, true. Good thought. Yeah.
But the other is, you had a great example of one of these exploits where a team found a bug in the game and used it to win a tournament. Do you remember the one I'm talking about?
Yeah. So this was about 2 years back, I think, in a global offensive tournament where one team was down, I think 14 to 3, I think, in a first to 16 match, and this team then deployed this new tactic /cheat/tactic where they had found a single pixel within the game world where your character could stand on, which they shouldn't be able to stand on. And by standing on that and then having a second player jump on the head of the first player who was stood on this one pixel, they could look with a sniper rifle over the whole game space. And this was so strong and so game breaking that they brought back the 14 to 3 to 14 to 16. So they won 13 matches in a straight row and then won on the kind of back of this. And when one watches the video, it's kind of it's very intriguing because the commentators speaking over the match and the kind of responses of the crowd are both really excited and really pleased and really impressed. But there's also this slight hint that no one's completely sure if this is legit, if this is fair, if this is okay. In the end, it was decided that this counted as a cheat and the team was disqualified for having used it. And this was then further complicated because it turned out that the team who used it, if I recall correctly, they hadn't found this exploit themselves. Someone else had, and then they paid that person to keep it quiet. And the kind of sleazy, in air quotes, aspect of that deception was a crucial part of why people felt it was a cheat, because they felt if the team itself hadn't realized that this was something they shouldn't be doing, they wouldn't have worked so hard to keep it a secret.
This has significant parallels in other worlds, whether there's legal cases now in both England and in this country, whether Phil Ivey and
yes.
On the edge sorting was cheating or whether it was a advantage play. In professional football, the team who's been best over the past 15 years, the Patriots, have read the rules better than others and come up with ingenious interpretations that most of the other teams have missed. And whether you define, and so there are a number of fans from other teams who consider anything the Patriots do to be cheating, and there are another of admirers of the Patriots for their success at this. It kind of depends on your perspective, and when they have passionate fans and or gambling on the games, it tends to make opinions vocal and long-lasting.
Yes, definitely. I think the Phil Ivey case is a great one, and I have in fact written a paper on this, whereby in the kind of legal contest, it shows so clearly the kind of political power that both the person doing the cheat/exploit/tactic and the party defending against it. It shows so kind of clearly how these two groups can mobilize different kinds of power and different kinds of arguments to try and make their case, and as part of that, just how deeply vague a lot of these things are for most games, and that in most cases these sorts of things won't come down to a kind of pure interpretation of how this game should be played, but will rather come down to which party has the greatest power to kind of enforce how they read the rule set for that game.
In some gambling games, let's say golf, there is a handicap that's given to the weaker player to help him compete against a stronger player. So if Richard and I were going to play golf, I don't recommend anybody watch, but I would try to convince Richard that I just had shoulder surgery. I didn't have any sleep for the past year and a half, and I'm almost pneumonia, and so because of that, he should give me a handicap of 10 strokes, and he'd be telling me whatever his version of that is, so that the handicap would go the other way. Now, you mentioned there are some prop bettings in esports, and prop betting sounds like this kind of hustling would go around, so that if you and I are going to gamble with each other, you lie to the other in order to get the best deal. Doesn't that happen at all?
Within esports, as far as I know, that is extremely rare or completely unheard of, in fact. In all the money matches I know of between top players within a certain game, I don't think I have ever heard of a case of one giving another a handicap of any sort. It's just we both put up the same volume of cash, and then whoever wins, and that's that. I think that's also when there's a big difference in the skills of players, whereas a pro gambler would think about trying to argue for a particular kind of handicap for esports players and those who want to become esports players or want to have the chance to play esports players. It's quite different in that there's a lot of stories in the fighting game community, for instance, where a really weak player who is not a pro will play an even money match against against a super top pro, and even though they know that they will lose that, they feel the lost bet is worth it, given the practice they will get against a top player, and just the kind of chance to play a pro is really thrilling and really exciting, things of this sort. And the top pro, meanwhile, also benefits from it, not just because they win money, of course, but also because in lots of cases, if a top esports player is about to play another player who plays a certain team or plays a certain character or things of this sort, the top player will want to practice against other players who also play the same team or the same character. So the kind of what kinds of things both players expect out of a bet of this sort is quite different, I think.
So, and in Bridge, sort of weak players who have a lot of money can pay pro players, top players, to play with them. Is there that kind of thing in esports?
I don't think I've ever heard of that taking place. The closest is what's called boosting, where most esports games have some kind of online ranking system, and boosting is where a really strong player will play with a really weak player, and the really weak player's rank will be boosted by the skill of the good player's rank. In some cases, I think that does have a monetary aspect, but I think in most cases it's simply a top player playing with a friend or partner or parent or things of this sort, where they are playing mostly for fun and playing because they like the person and want to help them get to a higher rank. So yeah, boosting does take place in a paid context, but I think most boosting takes place in a context of simply playing with less skilled friends and wanting them to do well, basically.
Very good. We've been talking to Mark Johnson, and we very much appreciate your time and your insight into the differences between esports gaming, and professional gambling. I have one last question for you.
Okay, I'm ready.
It has to do with teammanship. You said most esports players are part of a team practicing 12 hours a day. Depending on the gambling game, many gamblers are independent. In other words, I have no teammates. Richard did have a teammate for years, and now he has momentarily weekend teams when they go out and attack something. And there's some correlation between the team he's on in October and the one he's on in May, but they don't always have to be exactly the same. How is that different?
Interesting. That's a really good question.
I didn't mean to stump you.
Well, I do know that in like Korea and
good.
China, they have sponsored teams, so it's the same people on the team all the time, right?
Yeah. I guess there are a few differences there. I think one is that a lot of esports teams will pay a monthly wage to their players, which is where, as clearly within gambling teams, at least as far as I know, money is distributed in quite different ways, and the concept of a wage is not really present as such. I think another big difference is the question of sponsorship, and clearly things like Full Tilt and PokerStars and so forth will sponsor players, but that's only for poker players and for kind of big name ones, broadly speaking, whereas for esports players, a big part of how they earn money is through sponsorships, and those sponsorships come in through the teams they play for. So teams function as this kind of conduit for bringing in sponsorship money from Sony or Dell or Red Bull and these types of things to the players who are signed up with their team. And I think also, I guess another difference, like you said, Richard, is in the kind of permanence of these teams, I guess, in that esports players do change teams sometimes, but not especially often. And lots of teams are language specific, so a German team or a Swedish team or a Chinese team and so forth. And because in lots of games being able to communicate between players extremely quickly is crucial. It's very limited the extent to which one can shift around teams and still play with top players. As if you are, say, a German CS player, there might be only 10 top German CS players, and that means 2 teams of 5, and that's it, basically, because you have to be speaking the same language to get data over quickly to your teammates.
Very good. Thank you, Mark Johnson. Thank you, Richard. Go out and hit lots of royal flushes, everybody. Good day.